So, Paul Thomas Anderson came on the programme, it was last week, right?
Week,
to talk about Phantom Thread, which is his new movie with a score by Johnny Greenwood. And I should say that, as you know, I was just saying earlier on this week, I was introducing the two of them on stage because they were doing a live performance of the score by Johnny Greenwood. I've been a huge fan of Johnny Greenwood's score for a long time, right back to when Johnny Greenwood was denied an Oscar nomination for There Will Be Blood back in 2008.
Which we talked about in the
Exactly, which was the most technical of technicalities. So anyway, Phantom Thread. Story is set in 50s London. Daniel Day-Lewis is Reynolds Woodcock, who is the designer dressmaker at the House of Woodcock, which he runs with his sister Cyril, brilliantly played by Leslie Manville, who I think is just terrific. So she runs the business, basically. She tends to the books, but she also tends to the extraordinarily pernickety needs of Reynolds and his strange creative rituals. Rituals like breakfast must never be loud or interrupted, and if his breakfast doesn't go well, he can't get things right for the rest of the day. Things like...
Aren't you a bit like that, though?
Things like that he has women who are his muses, of whom he tires. And we find out very, very early on that she says, shall I tell so-and-so to leave? I'll give her such and such a dress. So we're immediately set up that there is a sort of cyclical habit here, that he falls in love with women, he designs dresses for them, he tires of them, and then it's left to Cyril to show them the door, taking the dress with them. So he is also obsessed with his mother, for whom he made a wedding dress whilst young. And there is a suggestion that the whole of the rest of his career has basically been repeating that, making a dress fit for his mother and looking for somebody who is somehow able to fill that particular void. He says at one point that he's been dreaming of his mother and saying her name out loud and then waking up, his cheeks wet with tears. And he's obviously in a funk. So he goes to the country where he meets Alma, who is serving in a hotel which he goes to have the most expansive of breakfasts.
Extraordinary breakfast.
And it's wonderful. If you've ever seen the adaptation, the television adaptation, the omnibus television adaptation of... It's called Whistle and I'll Come to You, but it's based on the M.I. James O. Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, in which Michael Hordern explains that there are more things in philosophy than there are in heaven and earth, whilst enjoying the most magnificent breakfast.
Wow.
I think it's kind of on a par with that. So he goes there and he sees Alma, played by Vicky Creeps, and immediately he feels some kind of connection. He says at one point, I feel like I've been looking for you for a very long time. Next thing, she becomes his muse. He is making dresses for her. But inevitably and cyclically, he starts to tire of her.
Cyril is right. Cyril is always right. It's not because the fabric is adored by the clients that Cyril is right. It's right because it's right. Because it's beautiful. Maybe one day you'll change your taste, Alma.
Maybe not.
Maybe you have no taste.
Maybe I like my own taste.
Yes, just enough to get you into trouble.
Perhaps I'm looking for trouble.
Stop!
So you can hear from that the kind of the brittle nature of some of the dialogue, particularly of Daniel Day-Lewis's accent, which is pitched somewhere between sort of clipped Brit and timeless Transylvanian. And there is certainly a hint of the vampiric about him, the way he sits with his kind of insect-like limbs curled up around him, the way in which his face has got a sort of slightly ghoulish, almost skull-like appeal to it. We see him at the beginning in his dressing ritual, sort of getting himself ready, and it did remind me a little bit, weirdly enough, of Gary Oldman in Dracula.
And also a bit of Colin Firth.
Okay.
It's
just fine. You said, as a single man, and then to some extent that would refer back to things like, American Gigolo. Well, I can't imagine Richard Gere doing this from us. Anyway, so what we have here is a tale of an impossible artist. So it obviously draws influence from the Red Shoes, and we see quite a lot of Powell and Pressburger in it. It's also the tale of somebody stepping into someone else's shoes. So we think, for example, of Hitchcock and Rebecca and that kind of the strange going into somewhere which becomes a prison. And it's also a tale of a cracked, masochistic love affair, which immediately reminds me of Punch Drunk Love. And I should say that I think this is Paul Thomas Anderson's best film since Punch Drunk Love. And you know how much I love Punch Drunk Love. I think this is now on a par with it, and I'm teetering on the edge of whether or not this is actually my favourite Paul Thomas Anderson film, whether it's dislodged Punch Drunk Love, which I have loved for a long time. And in a way I won't know until I've let it settle, but I've now seen Phantom Thread, as I said, 4 times, and every time I see it, I see more in it. What I love about it is Punch Drunk Love was a film which referred very often to Popeye. You know, they had that use of that, he needs me, he needs me, he needs me, you know, which is referring specifically to the film adaptation of Popeye with Robin Williams and Shelley Duvall. Yep, okay.
Okay.
This is absolutely laced through with threads from fairy tales. So there is talk of curses and superstitions. The superstition of the wedding dress that he says very early on when he was making the wedding dress, his nanny wouldn't help him do it because there are all these superstitions that if you touch a wedding dress, you won't get married. And in the end, he said his sister helped him to do it. And Elmer says, and what happened to her? Did she get married? And he says, no. And then we learn that one of the things that he's been doing since an early age is stitching things into the dresses that he makes. He says you can hide things in the lining of garments, messages, coins, little things. And one of the messages that he puts into the lining of a garment is never cursed. He talks at one point about the House of Woodcock being a dead house, somehow being cursed. So this thing about curses recurs time and time again. There are allusions to Bluebeard and to the Brothers Grimm. There are journeys off into forests where mushrooms, strange mushrooms, grow and are harvested by a heroine who has, you know, more than a touch of the Princess in the Tower or Little Red Riding Hood or, you know, Hansel and Gretel or any of those stories. The camera, which incidentally, the film doesn't have a credited director of photography because the people that Paul Thomas Anderson usually works with weren't available. A lot of people have said he's the cinematographer. He's quite clear he's not the cinematographer. He was basically marshalling a camera crew, working with the people that he's, you know, worked with, you know, grips and camera operators and all that sort of stuff. And as a team, they worked to create this cinematography. But the camera circles around these staircases that give you the impression of an ivory tower, and then at other times take you out into these strange forests. You know, the Beauty and the Beast analogy is there. And then beneath it all, you have this wonderful score by Johnny Greenwood, which invokes, you know, Passionate Friends or Brief Encounter, throwing back to those period pieces, recorded very specifically in a way to make it sound, I mean, you know, muted piano and then these soaring romantic strings, surging cyclical themes, all of which absolutely hark back to a bygone age, which again put you in that thing of, you know, the magic of cinema, those classic influences, but also, I think, evoke fairy tale, something mythical, something magical. And so therefore, so you have on the surface a film which is about a really prickly, difficult man who is defined by his rituals, who is absolutely intolerant and intolerable. And then you have this other layer underneath, which is that it's referring to all these other movies, which I love anyway. And then more sort of importantly than that, the whole thing has a fairy tale charm, which every time I've seen it has been more. I mean, the first time I saw it, I noticed it somewhat. By the fourth time, it just seemed to me that it was being, you know, declared from the rooftops. And on top of all that, it's really funny. And it's one of the things which it's hard to understand how it can be as funny as it is. Partly it's funny because the dialogue is, you know, paper cut sharp, and the way in which it's delivered by the cast, and the cast are brilliant. I mean, it's a really, really, you know, great central cast. These lines are delivered with that kind of, you know, lemon juice sort of bite, that zing. Leslie Manville, brilliant. At one point, she says, "I don't want to hear it because it hurts my ears." And it's just, you know, and when I saw it with an audience, they were really enjoying the laughter. They were really, really enjoying the. But there is this very, very sort of strong sense of sadness. It is very much a ghost story. You know, Dame Helen Mirren was talking earlier on about Winchester and saying it's a ghost story. It's not a ghost story. That's not a ghost story. That's a shouty fairground ride of a movie. If you want a ghost story, this is it. This is properly a ghost story. I mean, that phantom thread, which incidentally, you know, refers to a repetitive motion that goes on after seamstresses had worked, you know, day and night, making things that their hands would continue to repeat those motions, a phantom thread. But also maybe it refers to the lock of his mother's hair that he has sewn into the breast of his jacket. The lovely thing is that the more you delve through the folds of this thing, the more it has to give you. The funnier the jokes become, the sadder the sadness becomes, the more spooky and wonderfully supernatural those elements become, which include sort of fever dream apparitions of this world and the next. So I thought it was terrific, and I think it continues to be more terrific. I love the score is just great. The score is great. Johnny Greenwood is Oscar nominated for it. I think he's got a very, very hard task because that's a very strong category this year. I went a strong category this year, and I'm not even joking.
We are 15 basically.
Yeah. I thought it was great, and it caught me in its spell. It kind of wove this web around me, and I just was held by it.
You talk about the fairy tale. I wonder.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it like that before, but there are a couple of sequences in his car, which is a beautiful car, and the way that is shot feels as though it's part of that fairy tale. It's shot very unusually. It doesn't feel like the way normally a conversation in a car would normally be taken.
There's one sequence in a car which is very obviously a reference to Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, when they're driving through the darkened country lane and the camera is looking into the illuminated car, and that's very clearly a reference to the Durango 95 thing from. But the scenes that you're talking about, like when the camera is following the car and it's an unusual car down these strange windy lanes, or when they're talking, that they seem to be in some kind of almost dreamy world. And what's really interesting is that when you consider how crisp and clean the lines of the images are, and indeed the lines of the editing, I mean, it's a really well edited film, that it has that dreaminess, that otherworldliness, that ghostliness that is so sorely lacking from Winchester.